Studio MAPPA has been pretty dominant in the zeitgeist of people who like to watch Japanese cartoons as of late for multiple reasons. Some good, some very bad. Back at the start of 2020, the studio's insane production schedule had already been in full swing for a few years, producing an average of 4 shows per year since 2016, but they had yet to become what is arguably the biggest name in the industry, as starting at the end of that year they would release and take over a series of massively anticipated projects like Jujutsu Kaisen, the continuation of Attack on Titan, and later Chainsaw Man and Vinland Saga Season 2. But just before that precipitous rise, they released one of their best, and in my opinion, by far their most underrated series to date, and one that many, including myself, had thought was abandoned until just recently. From manga to screen, let's take a dive into the tale of Dorohedoro. Easily the most fun you'll ever have watching somebody be horribly disfigured, maimed, and beheaded while trying to figure out his own identity and living in a filthy, grungy, forgotten slum at the bottom of the world. Why it's so great, and why you should care that it's finally coming back. It seriously is way more fun than it sounds. The series opens, fittingly, with the horrific image of a lizard man with this guy's entire head shoved down his throat. Slowly, from inside the throat, another head appears, stares into his eyes, and says simply, "You aren't the one." We then cut to a wide shot and reveal the whole scene, where this fella, whose name we find out is dangling helplessly from the mouth of this hulking monster, as this lady absolutely clobbers another masked weirdo. The lizard monstrosity then, with his mouth still full of skull, attempts to tell his partner, This opening scene is a perfect microcosm for the series as a whole. Violence, mystery, action, comedy, all in the space of 7 pages or 1 minute. In the year 2000, Taiyo Matsumoto, author of Ping Pong, returned from a 3-year disappearance from the manga magazine scene with the release of Go-Go Monster, a surreal 440-page one-shot that he had created over the past years without the help of any assistants. Hideki Egami, a well-respected editor at Matsumoto's publisher Shogakukan, realized that, oh hey, maybe making manga artists work within insanely stringent weekly deadlines wrings all the creative juices out of them and forces them to work as an assembly line of assistants rather than as artists. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. According to Egami, it was Matsumoto who convinced him to start a new magazine with monthly deadlines instead of weekly that would allow for more experimental and thoughtful creations. That magazine, Spirits Zoukan Ikki, later rebranded to just Monthly Ikki, released its first issue on December 30th, 2000, and included in it was the first chapter of Dorohedoro. Yeah, that's what the video's about. By highly private and mysterious mangaka Kyu Hayashida, whose real name and appearance are unknown to this day. Side note, no, internet, this is not her. Where did you get that idea from? This is singer and actor Mari Natsuki, the voice of Yubaba in Spirited Away. Here she is hanging out with Tilda Swinton. Dorohedoro ran monthly for 18 years, transferred magazines twice as Monthly Ikki and later Hibana each ceased publication, and finally ended with chapter 167 in Monthly Shonen magazine in 2018, and gained a loyal cult following and a reputation as a classic along the way. In a city so dense, dark, and grimy that it's known only as the Hole, Kaiman has woken up and found his head grotesquely transformed into that of a lizard. It turns out this type of transformation isn't uncommon here though, because this is a tale of 2 cities, the haves and the have-nots, the sorcerers and the humans. The sorcerers, who live in a world far removed from the Hole, are a race of people endowed with the ability to produce this black smoke from their fingertips or mouths. Each sorcerer has a unique and usually strange magical ability, often but not always involving transforming things into other things, bugs, mushrooms, meat pies, you name it, and the amount of smoke that someone can produce dictates the strength of their abilities. These sorcerers are able to create interdimensional doorways and frequently travel to the Hole to practice their magic on the helpless humans who live there. To make matters worse, Kaimon has no recollection of anything before he was disfigured. Who is he? Who did this to him? And who was the man inside his mouth? His is a journey to find identity in an alienating world. But luckily, he's a hot-headed himbo with some incredible knife skills and seems to now be immune to magic, so he's made it his mission to track down whoever did this to him and kill every other sorcerer he finds along the way. What follows is a hilarious, delightfully surreal, violent, psychedelic, and intricately woven web of character-driven story, backed up by some of the most imaginative and detailed art around, both in the manga and the anime. The Kowloon Walled City, also known as Hak Nam or City of Darkness in Cantonese, was a dense, dark, and almost entirely ungoverned city that existed for much of the 20th century. It was a Chinese enclave within Hong Kong, which at the time was ruled by the United Kingdom, and consisted of one city block, just 6.4 acres of land. Originally a military outpost, after World War II, refugees from the Chinese Civil War flocked to the enclave en masse, squatting there and eventually developing it into a city unclaimed by either China or the UK. At its most populous in the 1980s, the Kowloon Walled City housed about 35,000 people in 300 interconnected apartment buildings within this one block, making it the most densely populated place in the entire world. Before eventually being demolished in 1993, it was a lawless place filled with everything from opium dens and brothels to unlicensed doctors and dentists, and lacking any building codes, it was so dense that sunlight rarely even reached street level. Even still, some residents recall pleasant memories while living there. In an interview published in the South China Morning Post in 2013, one resident who shared a 70-square-foot room with 7 other families recalls that life was poor, but we were very happy. We ate from a board laid over the knitting machine and sat on the bed. Everyone got along, and it was great to have so many kids to play with. The Hole and its residents share a very similar essence. It's also a relatively lawless place where people make the best of what they have. It's a dark, overcrowded, and bizarre slum, but there's always the charming feeling that people have carved out a life for themselves in this hostile world, whether it be the Hungry Bug gyoza shop or the hospital where Kaimon helps a doctor treat other magic victims. And in this world, magic isn't some wondrous, miraculous thing. It's a physical substance created by a specialized organ within a sorcerer's body, and a noxious pollutant. A thick layer of air pollution from the sorcerer's smoke has blanketed the city, blocking out the sun and causing myriad issues for its residents, like the one day a year when the magic-polluted acid rain causes the dead to rise from their graves. But not to fear, because they've made a festival out of it where you can register as an exterminator and buy fun prizes by collecting the metal plates that have been implanted in the necks of the dead before they were buried. Time is split pretty evenly between the Hole and the world of the sorcerers, and the dichotomy between the two is stark. The sorcerer's world is, well, also a bit gunky, to be honest. I don't think this lady can resist drawing some good gunk, but it's much more open with towns, villages, and palaces that are exposed to the open air, and it's defined by more intricate Gothic architecture rather than the brutalist industrial look of the Hole. It's also very psychedelic with its colorful backdrops and bizarre carnivals that seem to just be ever present. It's the kind of place where you might see a demon fly by in the sky and just give you a friendly wave. But it quickly becomes clear that while the world of the sorcerers is certainly less likely to give you black lung and a vitamin D deficiency, it's not by any means a utopia free from its own inequalities. There's a strict social hierarchy, and the amount of smoke somebody can produce is indicative of their position in society. At the top of the social order are brutal mafiosos living in lavish mansions, and at the bottom, the poor wretches who can't produce any smoke at all, making them essentially the same as regular humans. For their own protection, these people have coalesced together and formed a gang almost as brutal as the mafiosos trying to eradicate them, which deals in black powder made from smoke that they've harvested from the more powerful sorcerers to use for themselves. These gang members are recognizable by the cross markings branded around their eyes, which look quite similar to the markings around Kaimon's eyes. I wonder what's up with that. Probably just a coincidence. This series is absolutely stuffed full of vibrant characters, but Kaimon and Nikaido are the beating heart of the story, or the smoke gland, I guess. Nikaido is the kind and cheerful, but equally badass woman who discovered Kaimon after his transformation, and the owner of a gyoza shop in one of the more dangerous parts of the Hole. The two are similar in many ways, both lively people determined not to let the objective shittiness of their situation and surroundings tamp down their spirit, and by the time the story has started, the two have already become become a dynamic duo, with Nikaido helping Kaimon in his brutal crusade while also satisfying his ravenous hunger for just an absurd amount of gyoza. Kaimon is royally pissed off about what happened to him and driven by that anger, but at the same time he seems happy with his new life, and he adores Nikaido as a friend, so while he doesn't often think very deeply about what will happen once he does eventually figure out his original identity, there does seem to be an underlying uneasiness about what he might find. He's hard-headed and naive, unaware of how far over his head he is despite his own strengths, so when it's revealed early on that Nikaido is actually secretly a sorcerer herself, and the doctor who witnessed her summoning a door firsthand tells this to Kaimon, he just laughs it off as ridiculous. He straight up won't believe it unless he sees it with his own eyes. Mob Boss N is the most powerful man in the world of the sorcerers, besides the demons who live above and outside the caste system, and despite his magic being the fairly simple ability to turn anything into mushrooms, he's extraordinarily powerful and can supposedly produce enough smoke to level an entire town. He lives in a lavish mansion surrounded by servants and lackeys, and his thirst for power and narcissism have led him to essentially untouchable status. It's hard to get to a guy who's totally willing to engulf his entire mansion in smoke and transform everyone, including his own employees, into mushrooms at the slightest sign of danger toward himself. After hearing about Kaimon and his immunity to magic from the pathetic Fujita, the guy from the first scene, N is almost as determined to figure out who Kaimon is as he is himself. But while N may be a self-absorbed, violent maniac, his underlings are just as lovable as our friends, the Holers, the Holies, Holites. Shin and Noe are N's right-hand men. Wait, no, sorry. Oh my god. Okay, sorry. One mild-mannered man and one massive woman. These two are ostensibly the villains of the story, and while they do seem to genuinely enjoy the brutality of their work, they couldn't care less about N and his goals. If it weren't for their work responsibility, they'd be just as happy to share a meal with N's sworn enemies rather than, disembowel and behead them. And the same goes for most of the rest of the cast of misfits and freaks, both within and without N's organization, like Ebisu, the teenage girl with a mysterious past who suffered brain damage from having her face ripped off and then being turned into a zombie and then back, who now just sort of prances around maniacally and plays at being a grown-up. Or Dr. Kasukabe, the chipper 60-year-old doctor stuck in a child's body, and many more. Everyone in this universe is basically on their own side. Not to say that they're selfish or uncaring towards each other, in fact much the opposite, but they each have their own unique motivations and complicated relationships with the other characters around them. The characters are refreshingly non-formulaic, and the female ones get to look like actual people instead of cutesy little over-sexualized creatures designed to sell figures. There is a fair amount of nudity and what I guess you would call fan service in the manga, but it never feels exploitative. Everyone's clothes, including Kaimon's, are always getting ripped apart in the middle of battle, so it's kind of just the cost of doing business. And there's just something that feels very different about this mountain of a woman's boobs popping out a bit while she beats the ever-loving shit out of some drugged-out cultists in the woods than whatever this is. It's also toned down significantly in the anime. Oh, and did I mention there's a baseball episode? I'll take a baseball episode over a beach or hot springs episode any day of the week. That's my hot take. At its core, Dorohedoro is a story about identity and alienation. It's hard not to see certain influences from Kafka's Metamorphosis, and not just because of the giant walking cockroach that can only say the word. As Kaimon awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous lizard.
My pillow's stuck to me!
In an unforgiving industrial world, members of the lower class are used as mere tools to the members of the ruling class. The sorcerers don't see humans as living beings, but objects to be used for practice. And if that causes immense suffering on a societal level, then so be it. Kaimon is alienated not from his labor, but from his humanity. His labor is quite personal, in fact, regarded as just an object of someone's training. This psychedelic shot from the anime opening may appear to just be a silly way to combine visual elements from the show, but it speaks to Kaimon's feelings of alienation. This alleyway has something to do with with his transformation, and a vague memory of it is all that he has from before the event. An endless line of gyoza-headed kaimons walk robotically down the alley and stumble like the proverbial lemmings off the edge, a hallway that leads to nowhere. These countless copies of kaimon are dehumanized and interchangeable. They feel like cogs in a machine or ingredients in a concoction as they splatter on the ground into multicolored goo that forms the title. But unlike Gregor Samsa, who describes his work as a traveling salesman as strenuous and impersonal, only ever allowing him to form casual acquaintances that are always new and never become intimate friends, Kaimon makes intimate friends quickly. The shared struggles of the lower class create a sense of camaraderie between people struggling under the tyranny of the ruling class, and while this brutal world pressures Kaimon to accept his alienation from human contact, his passion will never allow him to, and he seems to make friends wherever he goes, even in the world of the sorcerers, like with this gruff but caring food truck owner. In summary, Dorohedoro is the metamorphosis if Gregor Samsa wasn't such a wage cuck. Q Hayashida's art is much like the content of the story, raw, scratchy, and absolutely packed with an absurd amount of detail. I'll often find myself starting a chapter and spending several minutes just staring at the opening panel to take in everything it has to offer. Alright, I need to break the fourth wall here for a second to tell you that I drew this background for this video and it took me so long, and I still don't think I quite nailed that super detailed look. This is the equivalent of a single panel. How do you do this, ma'am? I'm currently only about a third of the way through it, so a bit past where the anime left off, and I can say with confidence that this manga is a masterpiece. In 2020, the first portion of the series was adapted for the screen into a 12-episode series by Studio MAPPA, and helmed by Yuichiro Hayashi, a self-described fan of the manga and a well-respected director who had started his relationship with the studio with the horrendous but stylistically immaculate Kakegurui, and would later go on to direct the horrendous but stylistically immaculate Attack on Titan the Final Season, Attack on Titan the Final Season Part 2, Attack on Titan the Final Season the Final Chapters Part 1, and Attack on Titan the Final Season the Final Chapters Part 2, after the studio took over the series from Studio Wit. As you can probably tell from everything I've said about it so far, the source material would be no small task to adapt, with its highly detailed style and intricate meandering plot. But it's clear that Hayashi understood what made the manga so great, and the choice to utilize primarily 3D animation actually fit the source material surprisingly well and makes the best use of the resources at hand. In many ways a precursor to Chainsaw Man, which, as I said in the first video on this channel, was one of the best integrations of 3D animation of all time, I don't care what anyone says, the anime adaptation made great use of compositing effects and stylistic choices to blend the two mediums together seamlessly. In fact, when the Chainsaw Man anime got picked up, Tatsuki Fujimoto had this to say at the end of one of his chapters. Wait, the studio that did Dorohedoro and Jujutsu Kaisen is doing the Dorohedoro and Jujutsu Kaisen knockoff Chainsaw Man? What else is there to say? I can't wait to work with them. Not entirely accurate, I don't think, but funny. The 3D models actually allowed the animators to cover the characters in scratchy lines and details, something that would have been hard to achieve in 2D without drastically increasing the time it would take to draw a single frame, and this also makes the characters fit better with the beautifully detailed background art. Oh, and did I mention the background design was led by Shinji Kimura, the guy from a little movie called Akira, and you can tell. And you can tell that Hayashida's background art was clearly inspired by the Akira manga, so they go together like gyoza and more gyoza. And the slightly awkward quality to the movements fit well with the cast of bulky, goofy characters. The anime does alter the character designs slightly, making them a bit more rounded and approachable, and I'd be lying if I said that in an ideal world I wouldn't have preferred a fully 2D adaptation that matches Hayashida's sketchy and angular character designs a bit more closely, but in the world that we live in, this was pretty close to the best it could have been, particularly for the studio's first major use of 3D animation. I guess what I'm saying is you should really read the manga, but first, the anime is a great introduction, particularly because it condenses things a bit and makes it a little bit easier to get acquainted with the world and convoluted plot lines.
I mean, it got me into the series. Look at my little gyoza fairy. He normally lives inside my computer hanging off my graphics card.
The anime wasn't a flop by any means, and at least in Japan, it sold relatively well on the back of the cult following it had gathered over the past 20 years, but it also certainly wasn't the breakout hit that it deserved to be. And this was still the tail end of a time when, at least in the West, there was still some resistance towards 3D animation in anime. That, combined with the older characters and target audience, darker themes, and unconventional style, made Dorohedoro a bit harder to get into. So while it was well liked critically and even relatively popular, the hype just wasn't there to propel it to anything beyond the cult classic status that it already had. Months, then years passed, and Studio MAPPA adapted high-profile series after high-profile series, and fans who were initially hopeful for a sequel due to the show's financial success gradually grew unsure and eventually lost hope with no word from the studio about a continuation for the beloved series. That brings us to 4 years later, the start of 2024, when the silence was finally broken by an announcement on the official Dorohedoro Twitter account that the series would finally be getting a second season. Q Hayashida echoed the announcement and mentioned that she was personally very involved in it, and that subsequently leads us back around to the elephant in the room from the start of the video, Studio MAPPA. It's no secret that the studio's reputation has been tanking recently, with several reports about their tendencies to cut corners and underpay and overwork their mostly freelance animators in service of insane deadlines. And while MAPPA works with some incredibly talented creators and have created and continue to create some incredible shows on the backs of those creatives, including some of my favorites, the cracks have started to show. Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 was still impressive, but showed some clear signs that episodes were being finished just hours before airtime, and Hell's Paradise, despite the source material being wildly popular, felt like a complete afterthought compared to their other work. So while I do think that Yuichiro Hayashi and his crew did a great job with Season 1, and I do hope that he's still involved, it's hard to hope for MAPPA to be in charge of any production I care about at this point. That said, there's still very little information about the continuation, with no release date or staff announced, and, most notably, no studio attached to the project. MAPPA continuing the production is probably still statistically the most likely outcome, and with Attack on Titan finally over, Hayashi is likely open to direct the continuation again, but a confluence of factors certainly point to the possibility, at least, that someone else could be taking it over. First of all, they seem to have their hands full with a cornucopia of popular shows, not that that's stopped them from taking on more projects in the past, and the 4-year gap does seem to indicate that they had given up on the project. Where the official Dorohedoro Twitter account used to feature the name MAPPA in its bio, it's now conspicuously missing, and the official MAPPA account didn't retweet the announcement post or anything. Plus, if you were announcing a continuation by the same studio, why wouldn't you mention the studio if there's no secret? My pea-brain conspiracy theory is that it's being picked up by Andraft, the new production company that was just announced by Chainsaw Man director Ryu Nakayama. To be clear, this is extremely unlikely for several reasons, not the least of which that it doesn't seem particularly likely that MAPPA would relinquish the rights for one of their shows to someone who just left the studio on what seemed like less than great terms, but hey, a weird little armadillo creature can dream. Anyway, watch Dorohedoro, read Dorohedoro, rub soot all over your face and jump in a public fountain and contract cholera, and tell me what you think in the comments. Have you watched it? Have you read it? Who would you want to take on the sequel? Thanks so much for subscribing and hitting the bell if you want to see more stuff like this, and I'll see you next time.